The rain fell in unyielding, icy sheets, washing the thick mud over the hem of Beatrice Alden's faded morning dress. She stood completely still outside the towering wrought iron gates of Valerius Manor, her pale fingers curling around the freezing metal bars. The cold bit into her knuckles, turning them stark white against the rusted iron, but the physical chill was nothing compared to the hollow ache radiating from her chest. Beyond the meticulously manicured lawns and the grand stone facade she had once called home, warm golden light spilled from the floor-to-ceiling ballroom windows, slicing through the violent storm. Even over the deafening crash of thunder, the faint, mocking strains of a string quartet drifted into the freezing night air. It was a wedding waltz. Elegant, slow, and devastating. It was supposed to be her wedding waltz. Her left hand, trembling uncontrollably, released the iron bar and drifted down to rest against her flat stomach. There was no ring on her finger. The gold band with the heavy Valerius sapphire was gone. Lord Alistair, the Duke of Valerius, had demanded it back mere hours ago in front of the entire household. The memory of his dark brown eyes, usually so proud and fiercely protective, looking down at her with absolute disgust, still burned like acid in her throat. "How could you be so cruel?" "Beatrice," he had asked, his voice echoing off the marble pillars of the grand foyer. The disappointment in his tone had been a physical blow, sharper than any blade. She had stood there wearing the same black morning dress she had worn since her father's passing, unable to form the words to defend herself against a lie so perfectly constructed. A jagged flash of lightning tore across the sky, illuminating the silver crest on the heavy iron gates, and dragging Beatrice back into the merciless memory of that afternoon. It had started with a shattered teacup on the parlor floor. Cecily, her younger sister, had always possessed a face built for sympathy. A soft, heart-shaped face with watery, pale blue eyes and a fragile disposition that made people want to shield her from the world. Beatrice, with her sharp Roman nose, severe black hair, and cold blue eyes, had always been the pillar. The dutiful eldest daughter who managed the estate, balanced the ledgers, and suffered in silence. But duty, Beatrice realized too late, offered no protection against manipulation. Cecily had stood on the edge of the second-floor balcony, the wind whipping her pastel pink dress, weeping hysterically and screaming that Beatrice had driven her to despair. She claimed Beatrice had locked her in her room, starved her, and threatened to throw her onto the streets once she married the Duke. It was a masterful performance, culminating in a dramatic, perfectly timed fall. Alistair had rushed in just in time to catch Cecily before she hit the marble floor. He had wrapped his royal blue riding coat around her trembling, weeping form, holding her as if she were made of spun glass. Beatrice had stood on the landing above, frozen in shock, watching Cecily bury her face in the Duke's chest. But Beatrice had seen it. Just for a fraction of a second before Cecily hid her face, the younger girl had looked up at Beatrice and smiled. A cold, calculating, victorious smirk. When Beatrice tried to speak, tried to explain the absurdity of the accusation, Alistair had raised a hand to silence her. "Your jealousy has turned you into a monster," Beatrice, he had spat. "I thought you were a woman of honor. I see now you are nothing but a tyrant. I will not bind my life to a woman who would drive her own blood to death." He had stripped the ring from her finger himself. He had ordered the guards to escort her out. And Cecily, the fragile, broken victim, had tearfully accepted the Duke's vow to protect her forever. A vow that was currently being sealed with a kiss in the golden warmth of the ballroom while Beatrice stood drowning in the mud. Beatrice's nails pressed violently into the palms of her hands, the sharp sting of pain grounding her breaking mind. Her heavy wool dress, soaked completely through, dragged her down like the very weight of the Alden name. She had nothing. No carriage, no title, no inheritance. She had been cast out with only a worn leather satchel strapped across her chest. She took a shaky breath, the icy rain tracking down her cheeks like the tears she refused to shed. She would not cry. Crying was Cecily's weapon, and Beatrice despised it. Instead, she let the numbness spread through her veins, a cold, protective armor solidifying around her shattered heart. She reached a numb hand into the depths of her leather satchel, her fingers brushing past a damp spare blouse until they found the smooth, hard surface of a sealed black wax envelope. The Dowager Duchess Alistair's formidable grandmother had handed it to Beatrice 3 months ago in the dim lighting of the private library. "Keep this safe, Beatrice," the old woman had whispered, her grip surprisingly strong. "For when the vultures circle our legacy, do not open it until the foundation cracks." Beatrice hadn't understood it then. She had thought her position secure her marriage to Alistair a certainty. She understood it now. The vultures hadn't just circled, they had taken the nest. Cecily had stolen her fiancé, her reputation, and her home. But Cecily did not know about the envelope. Cecily thought she had won the war by taking the Duke. A sudden sharp cramp in her lower abdomen made Beatrice gasp, her knees almost weakening beneath her. She grabbed the iron gate to steady herself, her breath turning shallow and frantic. Her cycle had been late, amidst the chaos of her father's death and the wedding preparations. She had ignored the fatigue, the subtle nausea in the mornings, but the undeniable flutter, the deep instinctual shift within her body confirmed what her mind had refused to accept. She was pregnant. Alistair's child. No, she corrected herself instantly, her jaw locking. Not his child. He had forfeited any right to her to them the moment he chose Cecily's lies over Beatrice's truth. The moment he watched the guards push her out into the storm without a backward glance. A carriage rattled down the cobblestone path behind her, its wheels splashing a wave of dirty water against the back of her legs. Beatrice did not flinch. She slowly turned her back on Valerius Manor. The golden lights of the ballroom seemed to flash and mock her retreating figure, the waltz reaching a crescendo that sounded like a funeral dirge for the woman she used to be. The girl who had loved Lord Alistair, the dutiful daughter who had sacrificed everything for the Alden name, died right there on the muddy cobblestones. As Beatrice walked away into the consuming blackness of the storm, her spine straightened against the brutal wind. Her heartbeat, previously frantic and shattered, slowed into a steady, freezing rhythm. She was leaving with nothing but the wet clothes on her back and the black wax envelope in her satchel. But she carried the true bloodline. She carried the heirs to the Valerius Empire. She would disappear into the shadows, she would endure the poverty, and she would wait. She would wait until Cecily felt entirely secure on her stolen throne. She would wait until the Dowager Duchess passed and the inheritance was brought to light. And then she would return, not as a weeping victim begging for a man's discarded love. She would return to tear their world apart piece by piece. The rain washed away her footprints, leaving no trace of her existence. By morning, Beatrice Alden would be a ghost. A cautionary tale whispered among the elite. A disgraced woman who ran away in shame. Let them talk, she thought, her eyes fixing on the dark road ahead. Let them laugh in their warm, dry ballrooms. Their laughter would turn to ashes in their mouths soon enough. The coastal village of Oak Haven was a place where things went to be forgotten. The biting salt wind gnawed at the wooden shingles of the small cottages, and the gray, churning sea seemed to swallow time itself. For 5 years, Beatrice Alden had embraced the bleakness of this isolation. She had not come here to heal. Healing implied a return to the softness she once possessed. Beatrice had come here to harden. A floorboard creaked near the hearth. Beatrice did not look up from her columns of numbers, but the rigid line of her shoulders relaxed marginally. "Your posture, Victoria," Beatrice said, her voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. "A lady does not slouch even when she is merely stoking a fire." "Yes, mother," a small, steady voice replied. Victoria stepped back from the hearth, straightening her spine until her posture was as flawless as a queen preparing to hold court. From the shadows of the reading nook, her identical twin sister Eleanor emerged, carrying a heavy, leather-bound volume of history. They were 5 years old, but they moved with a silent, calculating grace that unsettled the village children and frightened the adults. They did not play in the mud. They did not shriek or throw tantrums. Under Beatrice's relentless, quiet discipline, they had been raised not as the illegitimate outcasts society would have labeled them, but as true aristocrats. Beatrice set down her quill and turned to look at her daughters. The breath still caught in her throat every time she looked at their faces. They were a devastating combination of her own sharp, regal bone structure and Alistair's coloring. They possessed the Duke's dark, fathomless brown eyes that observed the world with a piercing intelligence far beyond their years. Their hair, as black as ink, tumbled in neat waves down their backs. "Come here, both of you," Beatrice commanded softly. The girls walked to the table, moving in perfect synchronization, and stood before her with their hands folded neatly. Beatrice reached out her calloused fingers, gently brushing the dark hair away from the nape of Eleanor's neck, and then Victoria's. There, resting just at the base of their skulls, were the marks, faint but undeniably distinct. A crescent moon overlapping a stylized falcon in flight. The ancestral birthmark of the Valerius bloodline. It was a genetic stamp that had appeared on the firstborn of the Valerius family for 3 centuries. Alistair bore the exact same mark. When Beatrice had first seen the marks on her newborn daughters, she had locked the door of her small cottage, slid down the rough wooden wall, and allowed herself her one and only moment of weakness. She had pressed her hands over her mouth to muffle the sound of her own breaking heart. The marks were a cruel reminder of the man who had thrown her into the storm, the man who had traded her loyalty for a fragile liar's tears. But as the years passed, the pain had crystallized into power. Those marks were not a curse, they were the ultimate undeniable proof. Cecily could fake a suicide attempt. She could fake tears, frailty, and victimhood, but she could never fake the blood that flowed through these children's veins. Over the past 5 years, whispers from the capital had occasionally reached Oakhaven through traveling merchants. The great Duke of Valerius and his beautiful tragic duchess. The rumors painted a picture of a bleeding estate. Cecily, the fragile duchess, threw lavish, obscenely expensive galas to mask her ongoing failure to produce an heir. Alistair, the merchant's whispered, had grown withdrawn, a ghost haunting his own manor, throwing himself into politics and rarely smiling. He chose his ruin, Beatrice thought coldly, smoothing her daughter's hair back into place. Now he must live in it. "Mother!" Eleanor spoke, her dark eyes drifting toward the heavy wooden chest tucked in the corner of the room. "The riders are coming. I saw them from the cliff window." Beatrice froze. Riders in Oakhaven. Before she could question the child, the thundering sound of hooves echoed down the narrow dirt path leading to their cottage. The rhythmic thud was disciplined military. Beatrice stood smoothing the front of her faded dress, her spine instantly snapping into that rigid aristocratic line. "Go to the back room," Beatrice instructed the girls. "Do not come out unless I call for you." Eleanor and Victoria did not argue. They merely nodded and vanished into the shadows, their footsteps entirely silent. A sharp, demanding knock rattled the wooden door. Beatrice walked forward, her expression wiping itself clean of all emotion, leaving only a mask of polite, freezing indifference. She unlatched the door and pulled it open. Standing on her doorstep was a royal courier drenched from the coastal mist, wearing the silver and navy blue livery of the high courts. Behind him, 2 armed guards remained on horseback. The courier looked exhausted, casting a dismissive glance at the humble cottage before looking at the woman standing in the doorway. He blinked, clearly taken aback by the cold, commanding aura radiating from a woman in such poor garments. "I am looking for Beatrice Alden," the courier said, his voice faltering slightly under her dead blue stare. "You have found her," Beatrice replied, her voice like cracking ice. The courier cleared his throat, reaching into his leather satchel. "I bring an official summons from the capital, by order of the royal magistrate and the estate law of Valerius." He pulled out a heavy parchment sealed with dark blue wax. "The Dowager Duchess of Valerius has passed away." The words struck Beatrice's chest, but she did not flinch. The Dowager, the fierce, terrifying old woman who had handed her the black wax envelope 5 years ago. The only person in that grand manor who had perhaps seen through Cecily's performance, even if she had been too bound by scandal to intervene directly at the time. "I offer my condolences to the family," Beatrice said, her tone perfectly hollow, "but I am no longer associated with the Valerius estate. I was exiled 5 years ago." The Dowager's final will stipulates that attendance is mandatory for all named beneficiaries and living blood relatives, the courier recited mechanically, though his eyes held a flicker of curiosity. "Your name was specifically written into the legal summons by the Dowager herself shortly before her death. The reading of the will shall take place in 3 weeks at Valerius Manor. Failure to appear will result in the forfeiture of whatever has been left to you." He extended the parchment. Beatrice looked at it for a long, calculating moment. This was it. The foundation had cracked. The Dowager was dead, and the vultures would be circling the inheritance. Cecily would be maneuvering to secure the entirety of the estate's wealth, believing herself untouchable as the reigning duchess. Beatrice reached out and took the parchment. "Tell the magistrate I have received the summons." "Will you attend, madame?" the courier asked, glancing at her faded dress. "The journey is long, and the capital—" He trailed off, clearly implying she did not belong in the high society gathering that would surely take place. "I will be exactly where I am meant to be," Beatrice said softly. The sheer chilling weight of her voice made the courier take a physical step backward. He tipped his hat, hastily turned, and mounted his horse, riding away as if escaping a predator. Beatrice closed the door, listening until the sound of hooves faded into the roar of the sea. She stood in the center of the room, the parchment heavy in her hand. The exile was over. The years of hiding in the damp, salt-stained shadows had reached their end. She walked over to the hearth, kneeling on the stone floor. With careful precision, she pried up the loose wooden plank beside the fireplace. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small wooden box. She opened it. Inside lay the black wax envelope, untouched for 5 years, its seal unbroken. Beside it, neatly folded and smelling faintly of dried lavender and the ghosts of her past, was a gown. It was a midnight blue velvet dress tailored to perfection, adorned with a subtle collar of diamonds she had hidden in the lining of her satchel on the night of her exile. It was the dress of an aristocratic matriarch, a garment of pure, heavy authority. She had saved it for one singular purpose. "Eleanor, Victoria," Beatrice called out, her voice echoing slightly in the small cottage. The twins emerged immediately, standing side by side. They looked at their mother, their dark brown eyes sensing the massive shift in the atmosphere. The quiet, hidden life they had known was fracturing. Beatrice stood up, holding the velvet gown in one hand and the black wax envelope in the other. Her cold blue eyes swept over her daughters, taking in their perfect posture, their sharp intelligence, and the undeniable royal blood that marked their skin. "Pack your things, girls," Beatrice said, the faintest ghost of a smile touching the corners of her mouth, a smile devoid of joy but full of terrifying promise. "We are going to the capital. It is time to claim what belongs to us." The oak-paneled inheritance reading room of Valerius Manor smelled of beeswax polish, ancient dust, and the suffocating, sickly sweetness of white lilies. Above the massive stone fireplace, a towering oil portrait of the late Dowager Duchess looked down upon the gathered elite with painted eyes that seemed to burn with perpetual judgment. Beneath her severe gaze, the aristocracy of the capital had arranged themselves like a flock of well-dressed vultures waiting for the feast to begin. At the center of the room stretched a long, polished walnut table. Seated at its head, occupying the high-backed leather chair that traditionally belonged to the matriarch of the estate, was Cecily. Cecily's hands rested on the polished walnut surface, her fingers adorned with heavy diamond rings that looked entirely out of place on her soft, childish hands. The prominent Valerius sapphire, the ring Alistair had torn from Beatrice's finger, hung loosely on Cecily's index finger. It had always been too large for her, a glaring physical reminder that she was occupying a seat meant for someone else. But today, Cecily did not care. Today was the day the Dowager's vast independent fortune, The legendary Valerius trusts the southern vineyards and the unencumbered treasury would be distributed. Cecily knew Alistair would inherit the bulk of the estate as the reigning duke, but as his wife and as the woman who had painstakingly flattered the dowager for years, Cecily expected a massive, untouchable fortune to be transferred directly into her own name. She was already mentally calculating how many high society galas it would take to finally silence the old money aristocrats who still looked down their sharp noses at her. While Cecily mentally spent millions, Lord Alistair, the Duke of Valerius, stood as far away from her as the room would allow. He remained by the tall, rain-streaked glass windows, his broad shoulders tense beneath his traditional black riding coat and formal cravat. His long, aristocratic face was a mask of cold exhaustion. The dark brown eyes that had once held a fierce protective fire were now completely hollow, staring out into the gray, relentless downpour ravaging the estate grounds. The rain. It always seemed to be raining when his life fractured. Alistair rested a gloved hand against the cold window pane, his pulse a dull, heavy thud in his ears. 5 years. 5 years of waking up in a massive, silent manor that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. 5 years of watching Cecily's mask of fragility slip, revealing the petty, deeply insecure and greedy child underneath. He remembered the first year of their marriage. He had tried to be the honorable protector, trying to soothe Cecily's endless complaints, her sudden screaming tantrums when the capital's high society did not bow to her fast enough. He had watched her spend exorbitant amounts of the Valerius treasury on lavish parties, trying to buy the respect that Beatrice had commanded simply by walking into a room. Beatrice. Alistair closed his eyes, a sharp, twisting agony blooming in his chest. For 5 years he had tried to bury the memory of her face, the severe, regal line of her jaw, the cold, striking blue of her eyes, the quiet dignity with which she had stood on the landing as he condemned her. He had believed Cecily's tears. He had believed the perfectly staged suicide attempt. He had let his pride and his instinct to protect the weak blind him to the truth. It had taken a full year of marriage to Cecily for the blinders to finally fall away. He had caught her lying to the servants, manipulating the estate managers, twisting conversations with the same tearful, wide-eyed innocence she had used on him. The realization had struck him like a physical blow. Beatrice had never been the tyrant. She had been the only thing keeping Cecily's chaotic cruelty in check. But by the time he realized what he had done, it was too late. Beatrice was gone. His investigators had scoured the capital, the surrounding provinces, and the ports, but the elder Alden's sister had vanished without a trace. Alistair had driven her into the storm with nothing, and the guilt had slowly, systematically devoured his soul. Now he was bound to a woman he could barely stand to look at, managing a failing estate entirely empty inside. "My Lord Duke," a dry, raspy voice broke through Alistair's bitter reverie. He turned from the window. Mr. Sterling, the ancient and notoriously ruthless estate lawyer, was standing at the head of the walnut table. He was a skeletal man in a gray suit arranging several heavy, wax-sealed documents on the polished wood. "We are ready to begin, Your Grace," Mr. Sterling announced, his voice carrying easily over the hushed whispers of the gathered aunts, uncles, and minor cousins. Alistair nodded tightly and walked towards the table. He took his seat at the opposite end of the long walnut expanse, directly facing Cecily. As he sat down, Cecily offered him a trembling, watery smile, her hand reaching out to touch his sleeve. "It is a difficult day, my love," she whispered loudly enough for the nearest aristocrats to hear, "but we must be strong for the family." Alistair looked at her hand, his facial muscles twitching. He did not return the smile. He merely pulled his arm away under the guise of adjusting his cravat, feeling a wave of nausea at the term family. Mr. Sterling adjusted his spectacles and picked up a heavy silver letter opener. He lifted the primary will, a thick stack of vellum bound in black ribbon. "We are gathered today by the final decree of Her Grace the Dowager Duchess of Valerius." Mr. Sterling began his tone entirely devoid of emotion. The Dowager was a woman of precise intentions. Her will is binding, absolute, and not subject to appeal by any member of this house. Before I break the seal, I must confirm that all named beneficiaries listed in her final summons are present within this room. Cecily sniffled elegantly into her lace handkerchief. We are all here, Mr. Sterling. The entire family is present to honor her memory. Please proceed. The anticipation is too painful to bear. Mr. Sterling did not look at Cecily. He kept his eyes fixed on a separate piece of parchment on his desk. I'm afraid, Your Grace, that the reading cannot commence just yet. There is one summons that remains unanswered. Whispers erupted around the long table. The aristocratic relatives exchanged confused, highly suspicious glances. Alistair frowned, leaning forward slightly. Who is missing Mr. Sterling? Alistair asked, his voice low and commanding. I personally reviewed the guest list. Every lord and lady associated with the estate is currently seated in this room. Not every lady, Your Grace, the lawyer replied smoothly. Before Mr. Sterling could read the name on the parchment, a sudden heavy commotion echoed from the grand foyer outside the oak-paneled room. It was not the muffled shuffle of servants. It was the distinct heavy crunch of carriage wheels stopping abruptly on the gravel drive just beyond the main doors. Alistair turned his head toward the entrance. Cecily's watery eyes narrowed a flash of genuine annoyance breaking through her tragic facade. Who on earth could be arriving now? Cecily hissed, forgetting her soft, fragile tone for a fraction of a second. The doors were to be locked at noon. It is highly disrespectful to interrupt a royal reading. A heavy silence fell over the inheritance room. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner suddenly sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. From the corridor outside, the heavy, iron-studded main doors of the manor groaned open. The sound of the pouring rain momentarily flooded the hallway before the doors were shut with a definitive, echoing thud. Then came the footsteps. They were not the rushed, deferential steps of a latecomer. They were measured, slow, and terrifyingly precise. The sharp click of a woman's heel against the marble floor of the corridor reverberated through the thick oak doors of the reading room. Click, click, click. The rhythm demanded absolute, suffocating silence. The whispers of the aristocrats died in their throats. The vultures sat frozen in their high-backed chairs. Even Alistair felt a sudden, inexplicable chill run down his spine, a phantom memory of a cold, blue stare piercing through the fog of his apathy. Cecily gripped the arms of the matriarch's chair, her knuckles turning white, the sapphire ring digging painfully into her flesh. "Guards!" she demanded, her voice rising in a sudden, irrational panic. "Who is out there?" The heavy brass handles of the oak-paneled doors began to turn, slowly, deliberately. Someone was about to enter the room. Someone who did not bother to knock. The heavy brass handles of the oak-paneled doors turned with a sharp metallic click that severed the suffocating tension in the room. For a fraction of a second, the gathered aristocracy held their collective breath, their eyes fixed on the entrance. Then the massive door swung open, pushed inward not by a servant, but by the undeniable force of a woman who owned the very air she walked through. A gust of wind swept into the suffocating, lily-scented room, carrying the sharp, biting scent of rain and freezing sea salt. And there, standing framed in the grand archway of the inheritance room, was Beatrice Alden. She was not the broken, weeping girl they had whispered about for 5 years. She was not the disgraced exile who had been pushed into the mud and forgotten. She was a devastating vision of aristocratic absolute. Beatrice wore a midnight blue velvet gown that was so dark it seemed to consume the candlelight around her. The fabric fell in heavy, flawless folds, dragging slightly across the polished marble threshold with the weight of pure authority. Around her neck, sitting against her pale porcelain skin, a rigid collar of perfectly cut diamonds threw off violent, icy refractions of light. Her black hair, once severely pulled back to accommodate her duties, was now woven into a sleek, intricate braided crown that rested upon her head like a dark coronet. Her face, defined by that striking Roman nose and strong jawline, was a mask of terrifying executioner's calm. But it was her eyes that truly paralyzed the room. Those striking, cold blue eyes swept over the long walnut table, entirely empty of warmth, empty of mercy, and completely devoid of fear. The silence that slammed down upon the inheritance reading room was absolute. It was the heavy, crushing silence of a room that suddenly realized it had crowned the wrong queen. At the far end of the table, Lord Alistair, the Duke of Valeria, stopped breathing. His hand, which had been resting on the back of his chair, slipped his knuckles, hitting the polished walnut with a dull thud, but he did not feel the pain. The blood drained entirely from his long, aristocratic face. His dark brown eyes widened, locking onto the figure in the archway, his mind violently rejecting what he was seeing. It was Beatrice. His Beatrice. But at the same time, it was a woman he did not recognize at all. He had spent 5 years agonizing over the memory of her trembling in the rain, burdened by the belief that he had destroyed her. He had expected that if he ever found her again, she would be ruined, fragile, requiring his desperate apologies and his protection. Instead, the woman standing across the room looked like she could level the entire Valerius estate with a single whispered command. Alistair's throat closed. A suffocating tightness gripped his chest, the phantom weight of a sapphire ring suddenly burning his conscience. He tried to speak her name, tried to take a step forward, but his knees refused to lock. The sheer, overwhelming power of her presence pinned him to his spot like a physical pressure. He was the Duke of Valerius, a man who commanded legions and advised the crown, yet in the face of her cold blue stare, he felt entirely insignificant. At the head of the table, Cecily's tragic performance shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The lace handkerchief slipped from her trembling fingers, fluttering uselessly to the floor. Her plump, heart-shaped face turned a sickening shade of gray, the heavy layer of white powder making her look like a terrified corpse. Her watery, pale blue eyes darted frantically around the room as if searching for a hidden exit. The heavy black silk of her morning gown, which had felt so opulent moments before, suddenly felt cheap and restrictive. A child's costume played in front of the true monarch. Beatrice! Cecily breathed out the name, catching on a ragged gasp. Her fingers clawed desperately at the armrests of the matriarch's chair, the sapphire ring flashing in the candlelight as her hands shook violently. You were gone. Beatrice did not acknowledge her sister's panic. She did not even blink. With agonizing, deliberate slowness, Beatrice stepped fully into the room. The oak doors closed behind her with a heavy, final boom. She began to walk the length of the long walnut table. Click, click, click. The sound of her heels against the hardwood floor was the only sound in the vast chamber. The aristocratic aunts and uncles, the very vultures who had gossiped about her ruin, shrank back into their high-backed chairs as she passed. The air around her was freezing. She did not look at them. She did not look at Alistair, though she passed within inches of his frozen, breathless figure. She walked directly towards the head of the table, toward Cecily. As Beatrice approached, the sheer physical reality of her survival hit Cecily like a physical blow. The younger sister's chest heaved. 5 years of building her status of manipulating the capital, of stealing the Duke, all of it felt instantly hollow under the crushing weight of Beatrice's shadow. "Stop!" Cecily shrieked, her voice cracking, breaking the suffocating silence. She shot to her feet, pointing a trembling, diamond-laden finger at Beatrice. "How dare you enter this house? You are an exile, a disgraced, cruel woman who tried to murder me. Guards! Someone call the estate guards and have this trespasser thrown out." The aristocratic relatives murmured, nervously looking toward Alistair, but the Duke remained entirely immobilized, his dark eyes locked on Beatrice in pure, devastated awe. No guards came. The room belonged entirely to the woman in midnight blue. Beatrice stopped walking. She stood a mere 3 feet from Cecily, her posture perfectly straight, looking down the slope of her Roman nose at the trembling, panicked girl. "You are sitting in my chair, Cecily," Beatrice said. Her voice was not loud. It did not carry the hysterical pitch of her sister's scream. It was quiet, steady, and colder than the bottom of the ocean. It was a voice that did not ask for permission. It stated an undeniable law. Cecily flinched as if she had been struck. She glanced frantically around the room, searching for allies. "I am the Duchess of Valerius," she cried, her voice escalating into a shrill, desperate whine. "I am the wife of the Duke. This is my home. You have no right to be here. You have no right to anything." Beatrice finally shifted her gaze. She looked past Cecily's hysterical, trembling form and met the eyes of the ancient estate lawyer, Mr. Sterling. The skeletal man had remained perfectly still, watching the confrontation with a detached, professional interest. "Mr. Sterling," Beatrice said smoothly, ignoring Cecily entirely, "I believe you are about to announce the final unanswered summons." Mr. Sterling adjusted his spectacles, his dry eyes flicking between the two sisters. Slowly, he picked up the parchment he had been holding before the doors opened. "Indeed, madame," the lawyer replied, his raspy voice echoing in the vast room. He looked down at the official royal decree. The final mandatory summons was issued by the late Dowager Duchess to Lady Beatrice Alden. As her presence is legally required for the opening of the primary trust, the reading may now officially commence. A collective gasp swept through the room. The Dowager had summoned her. The old terrifying matriarch had bypassed the reigning duchess to call back the exiled sister. Cecily's legs gave out. She collapsed back into the high-backed leather chair, her chest heaving as she stared at Beatrice in absolute, unadulterated horror. "No," Cecily whispered, shaking her head. "No, she couldn't have. You have nothing. You are a ghost. You came back with nothing." Beatrice looked down at her younger sister. The anger that had burned in Beatrice's chest 5 years ago in the rain was entirely gone, replaced by an absolute, devastating emptiness. She did not hate Cecily anymore. One did not hate an insect before crushing it. "I did not come back with nothing, Cecily," Beatrice said softly, the diamond collar catching the light as she tilted her head. Beatrice turned her gaze towards the heavy oak doors she had just passed through. Her cold blue eyes narrowed slightly, a dangerous, calculating light finally sparking within their depths. In fact, Beatrice continued, her voice echoing perfectly through the silent room, ensuring that Alistair, standing paralyzed at the other end of the table, heard every single word. "I brought the future of the Valerius Empire with me." The words hung in the suffocating air of the inheritance room, a terrifying promise that froze the blood of every aristocrat present. Beatrice did not raise her voice, yet the sheer weight of her statement seemed to press the oxygen out of the chamber. She turned her head slightly, her midnight blue velvet gown sweeping silently over the polished marble floor, and looked back toward the heavy oak doors that stood ajar in the grand archway. From the shadows of the corridor, two small figures emerged. They stepped into the flickering candlelight of the reading room with a synchronized, chilling grace that defied their young age. Eleanor and Victoria were only 5 years old, but they did not cower. They did not cling to their mother's skirts or look around with the wide-eyed wonder of ordinary children. They walked with their spines perfectly straight, their chins lifted at the exact imperious angle that Beatrice had drilled into them over 5 years of silent exile in Oakhaven. They wore matching dresses of deep charcoal wool, simple but impeccably tailored, lacking the frivolous lace and heavy beads that Cecily so desperately draped over herself. Their ink-black hair cascaded in neat, flawless waves down their backs. But it was their faces that sent a collective physical shockwave down the length of the long walnut table. They possessed Beatrice's sharp, striking bone structure, the undeniable, regal jawline of the Alden bloodline. Yet their coloring, the deep, fathomless dark brown of their eyes, belonged entirely to the man standing paralyzed at the far end of the room. Lord Alistair felt his heart stop. A violent rushing sound roared in his ears, drowning out the sudden explosion of furious, scandalized whispers from the gathered aunts and uncles. His hands gripped the edge of the walnut table so hard the wood groaned in protest. He stared at the two little girls standing beside Beatrice, his mind violently calculating the impossible mathematics of time. 5 years. It had been exactly 5 years since that horrific night in the rain. The night he had demanded the Valerius sapphire back. The night he had turned a blind eye as the guards forced Beatrice out into the freezing storm. She had been carrying his children. The realization hit Alistair with the force of a physical blow to the sternum. His breath left his lungs in a ragged, agonizing gasp. He had traded the woman he loved, the woman who had been carrying the true heirs to his entire legacy, for a fragile, manipulative liar who had spent the last 5 years bleeding his estate dry and failing to produce a single heir. He had traded diamonds for broken glass, and the agonizing truth of his colossal failure was now staring back at him through 2 pairs of dark brown, devastatingly familiar eyes. "My God," one of the elderly Valerius aunts whispered loudly, her fan dropping onto the table with a clatter. "They have the Duke's eyes. They look exactly like Alistair when he was a boy." "This is a trick," Cecily shrieked, the sound tearing through the room like shattered glass. She lunged forward, her heavy black mourning silk catching on the arm of the matriarch's chair, nearly sending her sprawling across the polished wood. She pointed a shaking, jewel-encrusted finger at the twins, her watery blue eyes wide with a rabid, cornered panic. "Do not look at them, Alistair," Cecily screamed, her voice losing every ounce of its carefully cultivated aristocratic polish. "She is a whore and a liar. She disappeared into the slums for 5 years. Those bastards could belong to anyone. A stable boy, a merchant, a beggar. She found 2 dark-haired street rats and dressed them up to steal my inheritance. I am the Duchess. I am your wife." Eleanor and Victoria did not flinch at the screaming woman. They merely tilted their heads in unison, observing Cecily with the cold, detached curiosity of scientists studying a particularly loud, pathetic insect. Their absolute lack of fear unnerved the room even more than Cecily's hysterical outburst. Beatrice turned her cold blue stare back to her sister. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "You speak of theft, Cecily, while sitting in a chair you stole, wearing a ring you did not earn, demanding a fortune you could never comprehend," Beatrice said, her voice a deadly, quiet blade slicing through Cecily's hysteria. "But you were always prone to making desperate, foolish accusations when you felt your lies unraveling." Beatrice stepped behind her daughters. She placed her pale, elegant hands gently on their small shoulders. Alistair, Beatrice said. It was the first time she had addressed him directly since entering the room. The sound of his name on her lips made the Duke flinch. He slowly lifted his head, his dark eyes brimming with a catastrophic mixture of awe, regret, and soul-crushing grief. He looked at the woman he had cast away, the woman who now looked like an untouchable queen, and the 2 beautiful, terrifyingly poised children she had raised without him. "Look closely, Your Grace," Beatrice commanded, her tone devoid of any affection, treating him merely as a witness to a legal proceeding. "Because you, of all people, know that the Valerius blood cannot be faked." With agonizing precision, Beatrice gently swept the heavy, ink-black hair away from the nape of Eleanor's neck, and then did the same for Victoria. "Mr. Sterling," Beatrice called out to the ancient lawyer, "I believe it is your duty to verify the identity of all potential heirs before the primary trusts are opened. I invite you to examine the children." Mr. Sterling, who had survived 3 generations of Valerius family drama, moved with surprising speed. He walked around the long walnut table, his highly polished shoes clicking softly against the floor. The entire room held its breath, the aristocratic relatives leaning forward so far they nearly fell out of their high-backed chairs. Cecily remained frozen, her hands suspended in the air, a cold sweat breaking through her heavy white powder. The lawyer stopped behind the twins. He adjusted his spectacles, leaning down to inspect the base of their skulls. For a long, terrible moment, the only sound was the heavy rain lashing against the glass windows and the frantic, shallow breathing of the false Duchess. Mr. Sterling straightened up. His skeletal face was pale, his eyes wide with absolute, undeniable certainty. He turned to face the gathered elite and then looked directly at Lord Alistair. "The marks are present," Mr. Sterling announced, his raspy voice ringing with the weight of absolute law. A crescent moon overlapping a falcon in flight, the ancestral birthmark of the Valerius bloodline. They are perfectly formed on both children. There is no possibility of forgery. These children are the biological daughters of His Grace, the Duke of Valerius. Chaos erupted. The inheritance room exploded into a cacophony of gasps, hurried whispers, and shocked exclamations. The high society vultures who just moments ago had been ready to kiss Cecily's feet for a fraction of the inheritance now pulled away from her as if she carried the plague. They looked at Beatrice and the twins with sudden terrified reverence. Alistair's legs finally gave out. He collapsed back into his chair at the far end of the table, burying his face in his trembling hands. A low, wretched sound escaped his throat, a sound of a man realizing he had murdered his own soul. He had daughters, he had a family, and they looked at him not with love, but with the cold, empty judgment of strangers. "No," Cecily sobbed, collapsing onto the table, her heavy diamond rings scratching against the polished walnut. It doesn't matter what marks they have." She scrambled upward, looking frantically at Mr. Sterling. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly desperation. "She is an unwed exile," Cecily spat, pointing at Beatrice with venomous hatred. "Even if they are his blood, they are illegitimate. The law is clear. Bastards cannot inherit the primary Valerius trusts. I am the legally wedded wife. I am the reigning Duchess of Valerius. The dowager's will must leave the estate to the legitimate head of the household and his lawful wife. You get nothing, Beatrice. You and your bastard children get nothing." Cecily was panting heavily, a manic, triumphant gleam returning to her watery blue eyes. She clung to the technicality of the law, like a drowning woman clinging to a piece of driftwood. She believed she still had the shield of her marriage. She believed the title she had stolen would protect her from the storm Beatrice had brought into the room. Beatrice did not look angry. In fact, for the first time since she had walked through the heavy oak doors, the faintest ghost of a smile touched the corners of her mouth. It was a terrifying, beautiful smile that made Cecily's manic triumph instantly evaporate into cold dread. "You are absolutely correct, Cecily," Beatrice said softly, her voice carrying an eerie, devastating calm. "The law is very clear regarding legitimacy and lawful marriages. The primary Valerius trust can only be inherited by the true legitimate heirs of a lawful union." Beatrice slowly reached into the hidden pocket of her midnight blue velvet gown. Her fingers curled around the smooth, hard surface of the object she had protected for 5 years in the damp, freezing isolation of Oakhaven. "Which is precisely why," Beatrice continued, her blue eyes turning into shards of glacial ice, "it is time we discuss the validity of your marriage." She withdrew her hand, bringing forth the heavy black wax envelope. She held it up so the candlelight caught the unbroken seal, ensuring every person in the room, especially Cecily and the shattered Duke, could see it clearly. The final trap was about to spring, and Cecily Alden was about to lose everything. The heavy black wax envelope rested in Beatrice's pale hand, its smoothing surface catching the warm candlelight of the reading room. It was an unassuming object, yet it commanded the absolute attention of every aristocrat at the long walnut table. The air in the room grew unspeakably dense, thick with the scent of lilies and the metallic tang of impending ruin. Cecily stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous serpent uncoiling in her sister's palm. The manic, triumphant gleam in her watery blue eyes vanished, entirely replaced by a hollow, clawing terror. "What is that?" Cecily demanded, her voice a reedy, trembling whisper that barely carried over the sound of the rain lashing against the tall glass windows. "Alistair, make her stop. She is trying to steal my life. She forged a document." She reached out, her diamond-laden fingers desperately grabbing the sleeve of Alistair's black riding coat. But the Duke did not look at her. He did not offer her the protective embrace she had weaponized for 5 years. With a slow, sickening realization of his own utter foolishness, Alistair physically recoiled from Cecily's touch. He pulled his arm away so violently that Cecily stumbled her heavy black silk morning gown, pulling her off balance. Alistair's dark brown eyes remained locked on his daughters Eleanor and Victoria, and the cold, untouchable woman who had raised them without him. The devastation radiating from the Duke was palpable, a silent, agonizing surrender. Beatrice stepped forward, the heavy, midnight blue velvet of her gown sweeping gracefully across the floor. She bypassed Cecily entirely, walking directly to Mr. Sterling. 3 months before I was driven from this estate, Beatrice said, her voice perfectly level, carrying to the furthest corners of the hushed room. The Dowager Duchess summoned me to her private library. She handed me this envelope. She instructed me to keep it hidden, to leave the seal unbroken until the day the foundation of this house cracked and the vultures circled the inheritance. She laid the black wax envelope on the polished walnut table right in front of the ancient estate lawyer. I believe, Beatrice continued, her glacial blue eyes sweeping over the pale, terrified faces of the gathered elite. The vultures have circled long enough. Break the seal, Mr. Sterling. Cecily let out a strangled, panicked cry. She lunged across the table, her hands grasping desperately for the envelope, ready to tear the parchment to shreds. But Mr. Sterling, moving with a surprising, ruthless efficiency, slid the document out of her reach and slammed his heavy silver letter opener down onto the table, a hair's breadth from Cecily's manicured fingers. Restrain yourself, madam, Mr. Sterling barked, his raspy voice suddenly cracking like a whip. Interfering with a royal estate document sealed by the late Dowager is an act of treason under aristocratic law. One more outburst and I will have the guards remove you by force. Cecily froze, her chest heaving, tears of genuine, unadulterated fear finally spilling down her heavily powdered cheeks. She sank back into the matriarch's chair, her hands shaking so violently the Valerius sapphire ring rattled against the wood. Mr. Sterling picked up the envelope. He inspected the black wax seal, tracing the intricate crest of the Dowager Duchess. The seal is authentic and unbroken, he announced to the room. He slid the silver blade under the wax. Asterisk crack? Asterisk. The sound of the thick, aged wax snapping in the quiet room sounded like a gunshot. Mr. Sterling withdrew a heavy, multi-page parchment document. He unfolded it carefully, adjusting his spectacles as his dry eyes scanned the first few lines. As he read, the color completely drained from the old lawyer's skeletal face. His hands, usually steady after decades of navigating noble scandals, gave a slight, noticeable tremble. He looked up from the parchment, staring at Cecily with a mixture of professional disgust and profound shock. Then he cleared his throat, his voice dropping into a solemn, heavy cadence. This document serves as both the absolute final testament of the Dowager Duchess of Valerius and a formally sworn affidavit, Mr. Sterling read aloud, written by her own hand and witnessed by the Royal Magistrate General prior to her passing. The room was deathly still. Eleanor and Victoria stood perfectly silent behind their mother, their dark eyes watching the destruction of their enemies with aristocratic calm. I tied the Dowager Duchess, Mr. Sterling continued reading, having observed the rot taking hold of my beloved estate, employed private investigators to uncover the truth of the events leading to the Duke's sudden marriage. The truth is a poison that must be drawn out. Alistair squeezed his eyes shut, his jaw trembling. He knew what was coming. The entire foundation of his life for the last 5 years was about to be obliterated. It is formally recorded and proven with sworn testimonies attached herein that Cecily Alden's alleged suicide attempt 5 years ago was a meticulously orchestrated fraud. Mr. Sterling read, his voice growing harder, the words acting as a guillotine blade dropping in slow motion. The servant who assisted her in staging the fall and applying the bruising was paid generously from the Alden family accounts. Beatrice Alden was entirely innocent of cruelty. She was, in fact, the victim of a malicious conspiracy designed by her sister to steal the Duke's hand. A collective gasp echoed off the oak-paneled walls. The aristocratic relatives, the very people who had feasted on Beatrice's ruined reputation, now stared at Cecily with open, horrific disgust. The fragile, tragic duchess was a predator, a calculated, lying schemer. Alistair let out a ragged breath. The final remnants of his pride shattered. He had cast his pregnant, loyal fiancée into a freezing storm to comfort a monster who was laughing at him the entire time. The nausea rolling through his stomach was so severe he had to grip the table to remain upright. But the deception, Mr. Sterling's voice rose cutting through the murmurs, goes far deeper than a staged fall. The Dowager's investigation uncovered a secret kept by the late Lord Alden's wife. Cecily's head snapped up. Her pale blue eyes widened so far they looked as if they might tear. "No," she whimpered, shaking her head frantically. "No, stop reading. Stop reading." Mr. Sterling ignored her completely. "Cecily is not an Alden," he read, delivering the fatal blow with merciless precision. The Dowager's investigators secured proof that Cecily is the product of an illicit affair between Beatrice's mother and a low-born merchant. Cecily possesses absolutely no noble blood. She is entirely common. The silence that followed was apocalyptic. In the high society of the capital, deceit was common, but impure blood was an unforgivable sin. The high aristocratic purity edicts were absolute. To marry into a ducal line under the pretense of noble birth when one was a bastard of a commoner was not just a scandal. It was legal fraud of the highest order. Under the strict laws of the aristocratic court, Mr. Sterling stated, lowering the parchment slightly to look directly at the trembling, ruined woman sitting at the head of the table, a marriage contract signed under fraudulent claims of nobility is null and void. The union between Lord Alistair and Cecily is legally unrecognized. Therefore, she holds no title. She is not and has never legally been the Duchess of Valerius. Cecily let out a guttural, harrowing scream. She grabbed her hair, pulling at her elaborate curls, her mind completely snapping under the weight of her total, absolute destruction. "I am the Duchess!" she screamed, spit flying from her lips. "I am his wife. I am a noblewoman. You cannot do this to me." She looked to the aristocratic vultures for help, but they turned their faces away in revulsion. She looked to Alistair, but the Duke was looking at Beatrice, his dark eyes shining with unspoken begging apologies that he knew he had no right to offer. The Dowager's final command regards the Valerius estate and the independent trusts. Mr. Sterling continued raising his voice to speak over Cecily's pathetic sobbing. "To my true honorable granddaughter-in-law Beatrice, and to her legitimate heirs born of the Valerius bloodline, I leave the entirety of the independent Valerius fortune, the southern vineyards, and the unencumbered treasury. I leave the Duke his title and the manor, but the gold, the lifeblood of this family, shall belong entirely and exclusively to Beatrice." The power dynamic shifted with the finality of a slamming iron vault. Alistair remained the Duke in name, but Beatrice now owned the estate's survival. She held the financial leash of the entire Valerius Empire. She was the creditor, the matriarch, and the untouchable sovereign of the room. She had walked out into the storm 5 years ago with nothing but a leather satchel. She had returned wearing midnight blue velvet to claim the world. Beatrice stood completely still, watching Cecily weep and thrash in the matriarch's chair. The immense vindictive satisfaction she had expected to feel was absent. Instead, she felt only the cold, hard certainty of justice. She walked slowly toward the head of the table. Cecily shrank back, cowering in the high-backed leather chair, looking up at her older sister with terrified, tear-streaked eyes. "You took my ring, Cecily," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet whisper that only her sister and the lawyer could hear. "You took my home. You tried to take my future, but you forgot one crucial detail." Beatrice leaned down the diamond collar around her neck, glittering like crushed ice, her cold blue eyes locking on to Cecily's panicked gaze. "You can steal a crown," Beatrice whispered softly, "but you cannot steal the blood." "Take off the ring, Cecily," Beatrice commanded. The words were softly spoken, yet they cracked like a whip across the silent room. Cecily violently recoiled, clutching her left hand to her chest, as if Beatrice had demanded she cut off her own fingers. The heavy Valerius sapphire, a ring meant only for the true matriarch of the ducal line, looked grotesquely out of place on her trembling, sweaty hand. "No!" Cecily sobbed, shaking her head frantically, her elaborate platinum blonde curls unraveling around her tear-streaked face. "You cannot do this. Alistair, please. Tell them they cannot do this to me." Alistair did not move. He stood at the far end of the long walnut table, his broad shoulders slumped, his dark brown eyes entirely vacant of the protective fire he had once possessed. He looked at the weeping woman who had systematically destroyed his life with her lies, and he felt nothing but a hollow, sickening disgust for his own blindness. He turned his face away, refusing to even look at her. "Mr. Sterling," Beatrice said, her midnight blue velvet gown rustling softly as she straightened her posture. "Have the estate guards remove this trespasser from my property." "Immediately, madame," the old lawyer replied, a distinct note of satisfaction in his raspy voice. He gestured towards the heavy oak doors. Four towering estate guards men, who had previously bowed to Cecily's every hysterical whim, stepped into the reading room. Their expressions were impassive, but their allegiance had clearly shifted the moment the black wax envelope revealed the truth of the bloodline. They marched toward the head of the table. "Get your hands off me," Cecily shrieked, as two guards gripped her upper arms. She thrashed wildly, her heavy black mourning silk catching and tearing against the wooden armrests of the chair she had falsely claimed. "I am a noblewoman. I am the Duchess. You are a fraud," Beatrice corrected her, her glacial blue eyes unblinking. "And you have 3 seconds to leave the sapphire on this table, or I will instruct the guards to break your finger to retrieve it." The absolute executioner's calm in Beatrice's voice terrified Cecily more than the guards holding her. With a choked, agonizing wail, Cecily frantically tore the sapphire ring from her finger. She threw it onto the polished walnut wood. The heavy gold band clattered loudly, spinning for a brief moment before coming to a dead heavy rest. "Take her out the back entrance," Beatrice instructed the guards, not sparing Cecily another glance. "Do not offer her a carriage. The rain will do her good." Cecily was dragged from the room, her shrill, pathetic screams echoing down the marble corridors until the heavy doors finally sealed shut, plunging the inheritance reading room back into a deafening silence. Beatrice looked down at the sapphire ring. She did not reach for it. She had no desire to wear a token that had been tainted by Cecily's deceit and Alistair's betrayal. Instead, she lifted her chin and swept her cold gaze over the gathered aristocratic relatives. The vultures who had spent the last 5 years feasting on her ruined reputation now sat frozen in their high-backed chairs, utterly terrified of the woman standing before them. "The reading is concluded," Beatrice announced, her voice echoing off the oak-paneled walls. "The primary Valerius trusts the southern vineyards, and the treasury are now entirely under my control. Any outstanding debts this estate owes to your respective families will be reviewed by my accountants. If I find that any of you engaged in fraudulent business with the false duchess over the past 5 years, I will call in your debts and ruin you before the week is out. You are dismissed." No one dared to argue. The aunts and uncles stood up in a hurried, terrified silence, avoiding Beatrice's eyes as they filed out of the room. They recognized absolute power when they saw it, and they knew Beatrice Alden would show them no mercy. Within minutes, the vast inheritance room was entirely empty, save for Mr. Sterling gathering his parchments, Beatrice the twins, and the Duke of Valerius. Mr. Sterling bowed deeply to Beatrice, a gesture of profound, genuine respect, before slipping quietly out a side door, leaving the fractured family entirely alone. Alistair stood at the far end of the room. The distance between them felt like a massive, uncrossable ocean. The rain continued to beat fiercely against the tall glass windows, a brutal reminder of the storm he had forced her into 5 years ago. Slowly, his legs feeling like lead, Alistair stepped out from behind his chair. He walked down the length of the long walnut table. Every step was an agony of regret. He looked at Beatrice standing tall and untouchable in her velvet gown, the diamond collar around her neck glittering like the ice that had encased her heart. And then he looked down at the two small girls standing slightly behind her. Eleanor and Victoria watched him approach. Their dark brown eyes, his eyes were wide observant and entirely devoid of affection. They did not see a father. They saw a stranger who had caused their mother pain. Alistair stopped a few feet away from them, his throat constricted so tightly he could barely draw breath. His chest heaved, the polished, aristocratic armor he had worn his entire life shattering into a million irreparable pieces. With a slow, agonizing heaviness, the great Duke of Valerius sank to his knees. The thud of his knees hitting the hardwood floor echoed in the quiet room. He bowed his head, his hands resting limply on his thighs. He was a broken, defeated man, surrendering entirely to the woman he had wronged. "Beatrice," Alistair whispered, his voice cracking thick with unshed tears. "My God, Beatrice, what have I done to you?" Beatrice did not move. She did not reach out to comfort him. She looked down at him with an expression of clinical detachment, observing his pain the way one might observe a dying fire. "You did what you believed was necessary, Alistair," Beatrice said, her voice perfectly smooth and entirely cold. "You chose the fragile weeping victim because it made you feel strong. The truth I offered you was too heavy, too complex, and required too much trust. You chose the lie because it was easier." "I was a fool." Alistair choked out a single tear escaping his tightly shut eyes and tracking down his long face. "I was blinded by my own arrogance, by my desperate need to play the honorable savior. I let her tears manipulate me, and I turned my back on the only woman who ever truly loved me. I threw you out into the storm. I cast out my own children." He slowly raised his head, looking at the twins. His hands trembled as he reached out, hovering in the air between them, desperate to touch them, but terrified of their rejection. "Eleanor!" "Victoria," Alistair said, his voice breaking on their names. I am your father. I did not know. I swear to you, I did not know." Victoria, standing with her spine perfectly straight, took a deliberate half-step backward, moving closer to the folds of Beatrice's velvet gown. Eleanor simply stared at him, her dark eyes entirely flat. "Mother told us about you," Eleanor said, her small voice carrying an eerie, chilling calm that mirrored Beatrice perfectly. "She said you were a man who valued presentation over truth. She was right." The child's words were a dagger plunged directly into Alistair's heart. He let out a ragged sob, bowing his head again. The punishment of their cold, intelligent detachment was infinitely worse than if they had screamed or cried. They did not hate him. They simply did not care about him. "I am begging you, Beatrice," Alistair pleaded, looking up at her, the pride of the Valerius bloodline entirely absent from his face. He was willing to sacrifice everything, his title, his dignity, his very life, for a fraction of a chance. "Punish me. Take everything I have. Hate me for the rest of our days. But please do not shut me out completely. Let me provide for them. Let me try, even if it takes a lifetime, to earn their forgiveness. To earn yours, please." Beatrice looked down at the kneeling Duke, the man she had once dreamed of marrying. The man whose child she had discovered she was carrying while freezing in the mud outside his gates. 5 years ago, his apology would have meant the world to her. Today it meant absolutely nothing. "You misunderstand the situation, Your Grace," Beatrice said softly. She stepped closer to him, the heavy velvet of her gown brushing against his knee. She looked down at his broken, weeping face, her striking blue eyes devoid of any lingering attachment. "I did not return to this estate to seek your apologies, nor did I return to seek your ruin," Beatrice stated, her tone a masterclass in quiet devastation. "I do not hate you, Alistair. Hate requires passion, and you burned all my passion to ash 5 years ago. I returned simply to claim what belongs to my daughters." Alistair stared up at her, his breath shuddering in his chest, realizing the terrifying permanence of her words. She was not angry. She was just gone. "You are the Duke of Valerius. Beatrice continued smoothly, turning her back on him. "You will keep your title. You will keep this drafty, miserable manor, but I hold the treasury. I own the ground you kneel on, and I own the future of your bloodline." Shai reached out, extending her elegant hands to her daughters. Eleanor and Victoria immediately stepped forward, placing their small hands in hers. "Will you not even give me a chance?" Alistair whispered to her, retreating back, his voice a pathetic, broken plea. "Will you leave me with nothing but the ghosts of this house?" Beatrice paused near the heavy oak doors. She did not turn her head. She did not look back at the man kneeling on the floor in the empty, lily-scented room. "You chose your ghosts 5 years ago, Alistair," Beatrice said, her voice floating back to him like a freezing winter breeze. "Now you must live with them." Without another word, Beatrice Alden, the untouchable matriarch of the Valerius Empire, walked out of the inheritance room, the heavy oak doors closing with a definitive echoing boom behind her. She walked down the long, opulent corridors of the manor, her daughters by her side, the diamond collar around her neck catching the dim light. She did not shed a single tear. She did not look back. The storm outside continued to rage, battering the glass windows, but Beatrice felt only the profound, absolute warmth of total victory. She had walked out of this house as a broken victim. She had returned as a queen. And the silence she left in her wake was the most expensive, devastating sound in the world.